Smith Wigglesworth was born in 1859 in Menston, Yorkshire, England, into a poor working-class family. His childhood was dominated by hard work. Smith began working when he was very young, laboring in the fields and later in factories and mills. He received almost no formal education and remained largely uneducated throughout his childhood. But religion became an important part of his life at an early age. His grandmother was a devout Wesleyan Methodist, and she took Smith to Christian meetings. When he was about 8 years old, Smith later said that he experienced his conversion to Christianity. From that point forward, religion was no longer simply something practiced by his family. It became the center of Smith's own life. He became intensely interested in evangelism. By his teenage years, Smith was already involved with different Christian movements. At 16, he became associated with the Salvation Army in Bradford, where he participated in street preaching, prayer meetings, and evangelistic work. But preaching was not yet his profession. Smith learned the plumbing trade and eventually became a working plumber. This would remain an important part of his identity for many years. He was not a university-educated theologian. He was not a professional minister. He was a working man who spent his days using his hands and his evenings thinking about religion. Then he met Mary Jane Featherstone, known as Polly. Polly was already an experienced Christian worker and preacher with the Salvation Army. The two married in 1882. Polly became an important influence on Smith's religious development. She was more educated than he was and, according to the traditional account, helped him learn to read the Bible. The Bible became the central book of his life. For many years, Smith continued working as a plumber while preaching whenever opportunities arose. His ministry gradually developed, but there was nothing yet to suggest that he would become one of the most famous healing evangelists of the 20th century. That transformation came after the turn of the century. In 1907, Smith encountered the rapidly growing Pentecostal movement. He traveled to Sunderland, England, where Pentecostal meetings were taking place under the leadership of Anglican vicar Alexander Boddy and his wife Mary. There, Smith experienced what Pentecostals called the baptism in the Holy Spirit. He later described an overwhelming spiritual experience and said that he began speaking in tongues. The experience changed his understanding of Christianity. Smith became convinced that the supernatural experiences described in the New Testament were not merely events belonging to the ancient past. He believed they were still possible, and most importantly for the story that followed, he became convinced that divine healing was still available to Christians through faith and prayer. The plumber was about to become a full-time minister, and the stories surrounding his ministry were about to become extraordinary. After his experience in Sunderland, Smith Wigglesworth returned home convinced that his Christian ministry had entered a new phase. He had already been preaching for years, but now he believed that faith should produce visible results. He became increasingly focused on divine healing. Smith continued preaching in small churches and missions while his reputation gradually spread. Eventually, the demands on his ministry became so great that he left plumbing behind and devoted himself to evangelism. His style was unlike that of many ministers of his time. Wigglesworth was direct, forceful, and sometimes startlingly physical when praying for the sick. He believed that sickness could have a spiritual dimension, and he often spoke of healing as a battle between faith and the forces of disease. When he prayed, he did not always whisper gentle prayers. He commanded. He rebuked, and in some accounts, he struck the part of the body that he believed was affected by the illness. Wigglesworth insisted that he was not attacking the sick person. He believed he was confronting the disease itself. This approach would eventually become one of the most controversial aspects of his ministry. But controversy did not stop the crowds. People began traveling to his meetings because they believed that something extraordinary happened when he prayed. The reports came from people suffering from a wide range of illnesses. Some claimed that chronic pain disappeared. Others said they could walk after years of disability. There were reports of people recovering their hearing and eyesight. Wigglesworth also began using prayer cloths. The practice was based on a passage in the book of Acts describing handkerchiefs and cloths associated with the Apostle Paul being taken to sick people. Wigglesworth prayed over cloths and gave them to people who could not attend his meetings. As these stories spread, his reputation grew beyond Yorkshire. By the early decades of the 20th century, he was traveling throughout Britain and eventually internationally. He preached in large Pentecostal meetings in Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. Newspapers and Pentecostal publications reported on his meetings, while people who claimed to have been healed gave their testimonies. But there was a fundamental question surrounding all of this. Were these miracles, or were they recoveries that people interpreted through their religious beliefs? The surviving evidence allows us to establish that people made these claims. It is much harder to establish the supernatural explanation behind them. That distinction becomes especially important when we reach the most extraordinary stories associated with Wigglesworth, because he eventually claimed something far beyond the healing of illness. He claimed that some people had actually returned from death. Before those stories emerged, however, several healing accounts helped establish him as one of the most unusual religious figures of his generation. One early account involved the seriously ill wife of a friend. According to the story, doctors believed that she was dying and that she might not survive the day. Her husband had already begun preparing himself for her death. Wigglesworth disagreed. He believed that they should pray for her recovery rather than simply pray for the family to endure her death. He anointed the woman with oil and prayed. According to the account, she suddenly recovered. She got out of bed and, rather than dying as expected, continued living for many years. Another remarkable story involved a woman in Australia who had been diagnosed with a tumor. She was scheduled for surgery. A friend obtained a handkerchief that had been prayed over by Wigglesworth and brought it to her in the hospital. According to the testimony, the woman placed the cloth on herself. She was later prepared for surgery and given an anesthetic. But when she regained consciousness, the operation had apparently not been performed. According to the account, the doctors had found no tumor requiring removal. The woman and those around her attributed the result to the prayer associated with Wigglesworth. Stories like these transformed his reputation. People began arriving at his meetings carrying walking sticks, arriving in wheelchairs, or being supported by relatives. They came because they believed that the same power described in the New Testament could still operate in their own lives. And Wigglesworth became increasingly convinced that healing was not an occasional exception. He believed it was part of the Christian message itself. But the most astonishing chapter of his ministry had not yet begun. Soon, the stories would move from healing the sick to something far more difficult to explain. Wigglesworth would begin telling stories about people who had apparently crossed the boundary between life and death. And the first of those stories would involve a person whose death would change his life forever, his wife, Polly. By the early 1910s, Smith Wigglesworth's reputation as a healing evangelist was spreading. People were no longer coming simply to hear him preach. They were coming because they believed he could pray for the sick and that God would heal them. Wigglesworth's reputation grew even more after reports began coming from his public meetings. In Australia, one woman identified as Miss Ritt was reported to have spent 22 years confined to an invalid chair. She attended a Wigglesworth meeting and received prayer. According to the published testimony, she stood up and walked. Another woman, reportedly confined to a wheelchair for 6 years, was also said to have walked after receiving prayer. Her wheelchair was reportedly carried away while she continued walking. At the same meeting, a man who had reportedly been deaf for 20 years claimed that his hearing had returned. Other testimonies involved people suffering from chronic arthritis and other long-term illnesses. These accounts were circulated through Pentecostal publications and helped build Wigglesworth's international reputation. But there was another part of his ministry that became especially unusual. He began praying over handkerchiefs and pieces of cloth. The practice was based on a passage in the book of Acts, where cloths associated with the Apostle Paul were taken to sick people. Wigglesworth believed the same principle could be used in his own ministry, but his methods could be disturbing. He sometimes struck people while praying for them. To modern eyes, these scenes can appear shocking. Wigglesworth explained that he was not striking the person. He believed he was striking the disease. In his theology, sickness could represent a spiritual enemy, and healing could therefore become a confrontation with that enemy. He would shout commands at disease. He would order people to rise. He would tell them to walk. And sometimes, according to witnesses, people did exactly that. Whether these events were supernatural healings is a question the historical evidence cannot definitively answer. What can be established is that people reported these experiences, that the reports circulated during Wigglesworth's lifetime, and that thousands of people came to believe in his healing ministry. But eventually, Wigglesworth's claims went beyond healing. He began telling stories about people who had apparently died. One of the most famous involved a young girl who is said to have died from tuberculosis. Another concerned a childhood friend named Mitchell. But the most personal story involved his own wife. In 1913, Polly Wigglesworth died. Her death was real and is historically documented. What happened afterward is much more difficult to establish. According to stories Wigglesworth later told, he refused to accept that her life was over. He prayed for her. He commanded death to release her. And according to his later account, Polly revived. For a short time, he said, she was alive again. But then Wigglesworth believed that he understood something else. He believed that Polly's earthly life was finished. According to the story, he finally accepted that he had to let her go. She died again. The story became one of the most extraordinary episodes associated with his ministry, but it also illustrates the problem historians face when investigating Wigglesworth's miracles. Polly's death is documented. The claim that she was brought back to life is based primarily on Wigglesworth's later testimony rather than contemporary medical documentation. The same problem surrounds his broader claim that he raised numerous people from the dead. The number 14 is often repeated today, but historical research has found that the surviving evidence is much less certain. Several resurrection stories were not reported publicly until years after the alleged events. That does not prove that Wigglesworth invented them, but it means they cannot be treated as established medical fact, and this distinction is important. Smith Wigglesworth was unquestionably a real man. His preaching career is documented. His international travels are documented. His meetings were reported. People genuinely testified that they had been healed, but whether those healings were supernatural miracles is a different question. And that unanswered question is what makes Wigglesworth's story so fascinating. He began life as a poor Yorkshire boy who worked in mills. He became a plumber. He married a Salvation Army preacher. He encountered Pentecostalism. And eventually, he became one of the most famous healing evangelists of the 20th century. His followers saw him as a man through whom the power of God was still operating. His critics saw a charismatic preacher surrounded by extraordinary claims. And somewhere between those two interpretations lies one of the strangest stories in modern Christian history. The story of the plumber who became known as the man who claimed to heal the sick and even raise the dead.